I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government wants you to believe that the GOP wants you to believe that the secret to surviving the modern world is simply becoming comfortable with not knowing. But if your doctor says we are not sure what is wrong with you, the solution is not always to become emotionally stronger. Sometimes the solution is to demand an answer. Because while opposition celebrates a generation that can survive confusion, we ask whether we should instead build a generation brave enough to challenge why that confusion exists in the first place. We do not deny that ambiguity tolerance has benefits. We do not deny that in a complex world, young people need adaptability and the ability to navigate uncertainty. But the question is whether or not we want ambiguity tolerance to become the defining characteristic of an entire generation. We think this is harmful because uncertainty should not always be something people should learn to accept. Sometimes uncertainty is a sign that institutions have failed to provide clarity. Sometimes ambiguity exists because people in power refuse to make decisions. Sometimes the correct response to uncertainty is not adaptation, it's not to adapt, it's not to learn that okay, this is okay, but demanding change. What changes? In Gov's world, young people are still able to adapt, to explore, to change careers and etc. However, realize that they do not normalize ambiguity as inherently positive. Instead, they maintain stronger desires for clarity and accountability. 3 distinctions of framing. 1. Ambiguity tolerance is different from resilience. Opposition would likely blur the difference. But notice how resilience means you're able to survive uncertainty when it happens. Ambiguity tolerance means you're comfortable existing within uncertainty. But secondly, not all types of uncertainty is productive. We think there are 2 types then. Firstly, unnatural ambiguity, exploring career paths or discovering new ideas, for example, it still exists on our end because you are literally biologically predisposed to explore and discover as a human being. But secondly, manufactured ambiguity, unclear workplaces, unstable employment, unclear policies, for example. This is the type of ambiguity we oppose. But thirdly, youth are uniquely vulnerable to ambiguity. They are still forming identities. They are still forming their own values and etc. The moment society embraces uncertainty as a virtue, young people are less likely to demand for change, to demand for structures that do protect them. This is harmful because it's particularly the youth who has the unique capacity to call these systems out because boomers and millennials are already used to those systems. They have already worked like within and under these systems for probably like tens and tens of years and decades. But notice then that if it's not prevalent, the trade-off is the youth being one more likely to engage in discussions, for example, or political discussions. How we have like many kabataan party lists, for example. Or secondly, more likely to promote activism. And thirdly, are able to call out certain oppressive structures that exist in status quo. Now, on to my argument on the prevalence of ambiguity tolerance that creates a generation that adapts to uncertainty instead of actually like demanding solution. The way this argument works is simple. The way society teaches young people to perceive uncertainty determines whether they respond to problems by challenging them or by simply like learning to live with them. The biggest harm then of opposition's world is not that people become adaptable. We agree that adaptability is valuable. The biggest harm is that when ambiguity tolerance becomes a dominant societal expectation, uncertainty itself becomes treated as something inherently acceptable rather than something that often signals a failure of institutions, a failure of systems, a failure of the president and the vice president, for example. And we would suggest then that this changes the way in which young people exercise their own agency. 3 reasons. 1, ambiguity tolerance changes the way individuals make choices throughout their lives. What is important to clarify is that people under like government are not suddenly unable to handle uncertainty. They are not individuals who collapse whenever circumstances change. We think they are still rational beings. Human beings are naturally capable of adapting because uncertainty is an inevitable part of life. The difference is that under government, uncertainty is not something society celebrates as a virtue in and of itself. It is something people are encouraged to interrogate because in government's world, or in opposition's world rather, young people are conditioned to believe that unclear situations are simply realities they must adapt to. This means that when they encounter unstable careers or unclear expectations or broken systems at worst, their first instinct becomes, how do I adjust myself to survive this? Rather than, why does the system continue to place people in this position? This is why ambiguity tolerance is dangerous. When it becomes a dominant norm, it shifts responsibility away from institutions and places it onto these individuals. Instead of questioning why employment is increasingly unstable or why systems fail to provide security, young people are told that they simply need to become more flexible. Opposition does not eliminate adaptability. We preserve the ability of individuals to navigate uncertain circumstances. What we reject is where like adaptability becomes the replacement for accountability. But secondly, ambiguity tolerance creates a psychologically damaging culture of indecision and prevents meaningful commitment. The important symmetry in this debate is that both sides recognize that uncertainty exists. Neither side can create a world where every decision has a guaranteed outcome. However, the question is, what kind of relationship do you want people to have with uncertainty? Opposition creates a world where uncertainty is constantly embraced, where keeping options open becomes valued over making commitments. The problem is that some of the most meaningful aspects of human life require commitment despite uncertainty. This looks like choosing a career path, for example, or building like long-term relationships. People do these things precisely because they believe
POI.
certain values are worth pursuing despite the risk. But when ambiguity tolerance becomes normalized, individuals become more hesitant to close doors because every decision feels temporary and reversible. Sure, POI.
Ambiguity tolerance does not mean we will become political slaves. Your case is purely negative. My question is being correct and being certain the same thing?
Would like to actually engage with your case because your case is to say that you do not become political slaves. At the end of the day, we flip that on your side. You become the political slaves on your side because you're unable to question the existing systems, to question the existing oppressive systems that actually still exist in status quo. You constantly search for alternatives because uncertainty becomes something they're expected to accept rather than overcome. The impact is that individuals struggle to develop direction. A society cannot progress if everyone remains permanently adaptable, but nobody is willing to commit to building something because progress requires people who are willing to say that it's the future we want and it's the direction we are willing to pursue at the end of the day. But thirdly, ambiguity tolerance weakens accountability because uncertainty becomes an excuse for inaction. The biggest societal harm of government's world is that ambiguity provides powerful actors with a way to avoid responsibility. Notice how accountability depends on clarity. A leader who promises that they will solve this problem, etc., can be evaluated. A leader who says that we are exploring possibilities is so much harder to hold accountable. The same applies to institutions, to like governance, for example. When ambiguity becomes so normalized, failure can always be reframed as experimentation. Mistakes can become like learning experiences, for example. This matters because young people are not only individuals navigating uncertainty, they are future citizens, they are future leaders. A generation trained to tolerate ambiguity without questioning it becomes less likely to demand transparency from those in power. And therefore, the harm is not merely personal confusion, the harm is a society where unclear systems are able to survive because people have been taught that uncertainty is something that they should accommodate rather than challenge. The comparative is between a world where young people know how to survive uncertainty and a world where young people also have the courage to ask why that uncertainty exists in the first place. Proud to propose. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have leader of op here.
Hi, heaven. Possession pronouns. POIs whenever. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. Problem with Gov is that they just prove that people on their side of the house are more confident. Problem is, they don't prove that these decisions are ultimately better. They don't prove why these decisions are ultimately correct. This is now where I want to proceed with the reframing because I think that government just gives a very uncharitable framing of what the model looks like. Because this debate is not about whether young people should stay confused forever. This is already a mischaracterization of what ambiguity tolerance looks like. The prevalence just means that young people should not immediately force an answer every time they face uncertainty. It is about building the capacity to function even when life does not give you complete information. This is important because this is this house of most motion. On both sides of the house, the prevalence would still exist. You just have to weigh what does more harm than good. This debate is merely about extent. This distinction is important to point out, right? Because the nuance here is that uncertainty is not really an occasional obstacle that you are able to solve and move on. Because for young people today, uncertainty is literally something that they are already beholden to. The reason that this value has become common is because society has changed. Before the prevalence, previous generations literally lived in a world where many important decisions followed relatively predictable path, i.e. they study, they enter industries for decades, and they follow social expectations, and life decisions became clear. Having a direct plan was rewarded back then because the world itself was more predictable. But the problem is that the world today is not predictable anymore, and this is what Gov has to concede to because they cannot change the state of the world that we live in. They are already growing up in a world where technology literally develops faster than institutions can regulate it. Entire industries can literally change within a few few years because of things like AI and political landscape constantly shift, i.e., careers that are considered secure today may not exist 10 years from now, and social norms often evolve much faster than before. And because of this, young people naturally gravitate towards uncertainty already, because usually, since they are the first ones to encounter things like new societal expectations and new technologies and new info, unlike older generations that already have that already have established identities and routines, the youth do not have the luxury to become certain because they are still making decisions that will shape the rest of their lives. They do things like questioning what to study, what careers to pursue, or how to navigate a society that keeps changing while still trying to understand it. This is why I am confused about the capacity analysis coming from side government. My question is, do they have the capacity to be certain? The answer is no. This is important because tolerance and celebrating it are two different things. The info slide never says that ambiguity will replace clarity or that uncertainty is inherently good. It simply describes the ability to navigate unclear situations without unnecessary stress or anxiety while remaining adaptable and open-minded. This is a very different claim from saying that people should avoid decisions or that they refuse to seek answers at all. Every person would still want clarity eventually because this is how the human psyche works. People still want to commit. The only distinction that happens is that ambiguity tolerance simply recognizes that clarity is often something you arrive at gradually rather than something that is immediately available. This is the frame from Gov, right? They want people to become overly short-termist to the point that they want all decisions to be urgent. This is bad because the info slide literally says that you maintain an open-minded approach. Obviously, this does not mean that you will believe that every perspective is correct. It means that you recognize that when information is incomplete, it is reasonable to keep evaluating further instead of pretending that certainty exists even when it does not. The value being promoted here is for you to become is to have humility. The prevalence has simply adapted because this is a reality that young people live in on both sides of the house. You cannot remove this on up. We face it and we become better people. First argument is just I want to talk about how this is good because you help young people grow without rushing into the wrong person. This is important because young people are still building who they are, and many young people simply do not have enough experience yet to confidently know what they want or who they will become. I.e., when you're an adolescent or when you're in early adulthood, these are periods where people are still constantly encountering new experiences for the first time. Their beliefs, their friendships, or their ambitions will naturally change because they're still collecting information about themselves and the world. The problem is that many young people also grow up surrounded by enormous pressure to immediately figure themselves out. This came from their parents or from their grandparents that was used to the fact that certainty is the most important thing when you're a millennial. They are expected to know what career they want or what opinions should they hold, some even if the future of this world is literally so uncertain compared to that of the previous generations. This pressure does not make you more mature, nor does it make you force better decisions contrary to what government tells you. Instead, you only encourage a certainty that is premature. So rather than asking whether a decision genuinely reflects who you are, many young people simply choose whatever gives them immediate security because having an answer feels safer for them rather than admitting that they're still unsure. On side government, there's always this ticking time bomb of social approval that you always have to be validated by other people because you are still unsure. Ambiguity tolerance reduces this unhealthy pressure because you teach them that uncertainty during youth does not automatically mean that you're failed. It means that you are making sense of the world around you that is constantly changing because they no longer feel that every decision defines the rest of their lives. They become more willing to do things like reflect and self-introspect and understand themselves before making commitments, especially since teenagers nowadays rarely reflect since their minds are heavily brain rotted. This is especially important because young people
Why?
are naturally more vulnerable to things like external influence. They have less life experience to compare ideas against, and they have greater sensitivity towards social judgment. So if uncertainty is treated as something that is shameful, they become much more likely to conform simply because everyone else appears confident.
POI.
Before anything else, POI.
If ambiguity tolerance simply means waiting for the right answer, then who gets to decide when waiting becomes too long? At what point does patience stop being wisdom and start becoming an excuse for people in power to avoid giving answers?
Problem with that POI is you force me to make a decision on something that people naturally experience themselves. You have to realize that we don't have all the answers all the time. That's why the alternative on side opposition is that when you support this, you reflect and you self-introspect. This is the most important thing because even if you do not have the final answer, at least you are reflecting, at least you are philosophizing about the world. Even in the worst case, where some Gen Z or Gen Alpha become impulsive, even when they become exposed to things like brain rot culture, ambiguity tolerance solves this because instead of immediately immediately adapting every identity or every opinion as an absolute truth, they become more comfortable saying that, oh, I'm not sure yet, which gives themselves space to evaluate whether something genuinely aligns with who they want to become. We give people time, unlike on-site government where you force them into short-termist and urgent decisions. Guys, you cannot make people short-termist, you cannot make youth the short-termist because they're still discovering themselves. They do not know if this is the proper decision for them, but the problem is that you fit them into a mold where they need to make a decision. On our side of the house, we allow people to develop at a healthy pace. We build their humanity better. Unlike on-site government where the urgency that you get is very, very bad, because you have to realize that just because you seek immediate uncertainty does not mean it is the most credible. Sometimes the immediate certainty that you get on-site government is just probably the most confident, it's probably the most comfortable, but it is not the most credible. Government up until today still has the burden to prove why certainty equals correctness. I don't think they can prove this.
Thank you for that speech. Also, just to follow up for team opposition to give the speaker positions on the chat. That being said, let's have DPM here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Hi everyone, my name is Cebu, pronouns she, her. POI time, anytime, just please don't badger and through voice because I'm not gonna look at chat. Yeah, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If uncertainty is already increasing because of technology and changing industries and what have you, then the last thing society needs is a generation that becomes even more psychologically comfortable with uncertainty. Precisely because the external world is unstable coming from opposition, we need stronger internal conviction. This is ops framing, by the way, that youth are susceptible to influence and societal pressure and what have you. Otherwise, you have uncertainty outside and uncertainty inside. That makes adaptation harder for the youth, for example, not easier. But secondly, they tell us about how you don't grow people into the right people, for example, because of societal pressure and what have you, and they're forced to become like an engineer, for example, even though if they don't really want to. Notice that every meaningful decision in life has the possibility of becoming the wrong person, in which you choose a career, in which you choose a degree, and when you vote, and when you fall in love or you start a business, all happen under uncertainty. If your response to uncertainty is simply do not commit or be okay with it, then you don't protect the young people from becoming the wrong person. You simply delay the formation of the person they were supposed to become. Ironically, their world makes it easier to become the wrong person, because if you're always comfortable entertaining every possibility, you're less likely to develop these stable principles that allow you to distinguish between good and bad ideas. In that principle alone, it's very justifiable to oppose. Secondly, they treat ambiguity tolerance as if it only removes the pressure. We tell you that it also removes urgency for these youth, because if every major decision becomes something you can indefinitely revisit because nothing is final, people become less likely to specialize, to lead, to organize, or advocate when action is actually required from this generation, for example. But let's go on to my extensions then. Notice that institutions are self-preserving. This is important, coming from Lian, on how every institution has incentives to justify its own existence. The governments defend existing policies, the schools defend existing curricula, the corporations defend existing business models, and even cultural norms are reinforced by the people who have already succeeded under them. This means that the burden of proving that change is necessary almost never comes from within the institutions themselves. It comes from the actors who are sufficiently detached from them, and that actor has always been the youth. The reason is very intuitive, panel, because the youth possess significantly lower sunk costs. They have not spent decades building identities, careers, or social capital around the existing system. Therefore, they are uniquely capable of asking not merely whether a system functions, but whether it deserves to continue existing at all. This leads me to my first extension, that the prevalence of ambiguity tolerance fundamentally changes the incentives of those young people. This is also me engaging with opposition's case, because I'm telling you that the best case for them is not to just talk about pressure, but also the incentive of this generation as well. Notice that questioning a system is the only first half of social change. The second half is deciding that one alternative is sufficiently better to fight for. This is where I engage on their POI coming from Tulian, right? At no point did we claim that ambiguity tolerance creates political slaves. The burden isn't whether the people change institutions at all. The burden that we have to prove is how effectively and how often they do so under this prevalence. Notice that because every social movement begins with uncertainty, the difference is that these successful movements actually arrive at that conviction. Our problem with the prevalence then is because of the prevalence of ambiguity tolerance is that it normalizes remaining comfortable in that uncertainty for longer. If you make them increasingly comfortable with ambiguity, you don't eliminate reform. You simply make them reform less likely, slower, and less decisive. That's all we need to win, because these reforms are important for the youth. For example, to remove the social pressures to become an engineer, for example, to remove the institutional corruption that makes them have to convict to one field even though if they want to become a psychologist, for example. But then secondly, notice that opposition world ironically strengthens the very institution they want to change, for example. Because notice
POI.
how existing institutions do not need everyone to support them. They merely need their challenges to hesitate. That is the easiest way for a bad institution to survive. It's not overwhelming public approval, but sure, I'll take that POI.
Your model is that we should demand solutions from institutions. My question is who decides what these solutions are and how do you stop them from simply accepting the first person who confidently claims to have the solution if their psyche is short-termist?
Yeah, but notice how the ecosystem of a society is so much more better if people actually arrive at conviction. Under your side, because the youth are so under the prevalence, this means that they're more willing to take up more options, for example, which doesn't really lead them into any form of decision. Like sure, that it sounds philosophically sophisticated, but you don't really create any institutional change on your side. Secondly, then we feel because of the fact that every additional young person who postpones taking a position is gonna try to wait for more certainty or continues to entertain every competing interpretation. That's literally one less person organizing, innovating, or voting or leading for reforms. And notice how there's an urgency within society right now coming from opposition because of the fact that technology is able to, develop so much more than humans that you need these reforms to properly collaborate with that type of justification. This means that the default beneficiary of ambiguity tolerance is always its status quo coming from opposition. They still need to engage in our case and as to how you're able to create a proper ecosystem within the society with this prevalence anyways, which is why it's very much like justifiable to oppose. But lastly, let's weigh, because opposition tells you that ambiguity tolerance creates adaptability, and we don't deny that. But adaptability is coming from Lian is only valuable if it eventually translates into action. We tell you that a society cannot continuously improve through people who merely adapt to existing realities. You improve through people willing to reject them. That is why we protect the comparative role of the youth. Notice how opposition never engages on Lian's case on how if you want to create a good society, you have to agree. You have to agree with our framing that these generations obviously have different roles within society, and within the youth is that it's not how because certainty is always correct, but because the progress requires a generation willing to eventually commit to a version of a better society. And what Lian explained to you is that it's never usually the older generations who's able to do that because of the fact that they have benefited from the old systems. For example, they have benefited from the corruption within churches. For example, this is how they built their careers, they built their identity. This means that when you have multiple generations with under that prevalence and not you don't have a external actor, for example, to coalesce with these very harmful narratives and very harmful traditions to continue the growth of and expansion of that society. But then thirdly, we tell you that because every generation inherits the world, only the youth are expected to reimagine it. Notice how even if the very generation responsible for challenging society becomes increasingly comfortable with ambiguity, then notice how it's entirely justifiable to oppose the prevalence of that mindset because society loses the demographic and the demographic and most capable of driving meaningful change. That is our standard for opposing because you no longer make it so that the society is able to grow and reform because of the fact that everyone is just every generation is now okay with this ambiguity. But then lastly, I don't really understand their case on as to how being certain is not the same as being correct. We never said that. But I flip this because if that's true and you can't equate it, then why would you make ambiguity your ambiguity is standard for the whole generation, for example. In terms of how we're able to give more opportunities for the youth, in terms of how we're able to give them more institutional change, in terms of how you're better able to move society, this win obviously goes up government. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Let's have DLO here.
Hello, can I just ask if I'm audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. Let me just have 30 seconds to prepare my timer. Okay, hi. My name is Aki. Pronouns she, her, POS at fifth. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, one. Throughout 14 minutes, government was never able to give us any positive material coming from their house. The only thing they give us is a slippery slope case that even them, on their framing, cannot solve. Let's clarify a few things then. Firstly, you ought to note that ambiguity tolerance is not just the absence of standard, it's not the absence of standard, it is the ability to continue making these rational decisions when the fact is certainty is still impossible. I think the biggest flaw in government side of the house is that they just assume that uncertainty is something that young people can probably avoid. But the thing is, Heaven already beautifully explains that we cannot avoid this because of the fact that things like institutions and society is still interconnected. Things like, for example, your career paths are changing, therefore, social expectations are also going to evolve, which means that government confuses accepting this uncertainty with things like accepting institutional failure, which is their first point. But I think that you ought to note that these things are really fundamentally different because of the fact that our side never says that, okay, uncertainty is desirable or that institutions should stop providing clarity. We ought to tell you that it's only just when uncertainty inevitably exists, we want to have young people, they should have the capacity to be able to function despite it. First response then, how is it that ambiguity tolerance does not reduce the demand for accountability? Because of the fact that on government, their mechanism assumes that because you have ambiguity tolerance, people then become comfortable and then people stop demanding change. There is no logical reason why it's the exact flow of events that will have to follow. Because I think that a person can still recognize that an institution has failed while still having the emotional capacity and the physical capacity to continue making rational decisions. Like, for example, a student can criticize an unclear university policy about grades, for example, while still adapting their academic plans. This is literally what's happening in our school right now, which means that this is so much better instead of just being paralyzed by uncertainty, which already reduces the benefit the government wants about having change and reform in the first place. Which means that things like resilience and accountability are already complementary to each other, not mutually exclusive like what Gov tries to tell you. The second response is then is that their world assumes that institutions can already eliminate all types of uncertainty. Even in government's best case world, where institutions are still transparent and accountable, uncertainty still exists because it is inherent to life and not just institutions. This is where Heaven beautifully explains to you why is it that these things are interconnected and you cannot separate them from each other. Like, for example, if your boss suddenly dies, someone has to take place. What that means is that your institution will probably have to change the way positions are made again and again. You can also have an example, like, for example, things like economic recessions, things like global conflicts. None of these things are solved simply because of the fact that institutions are already better. Their model only addresses uncertainty that institutions create. I think you still ignore the uncertainty that no institution can ever remove. And I think that's the most important part of this debate, right? Because at least on opposition side of the house, our side is able to prepare the youth for both. Why is that? Because of the fact that you ought to note that still, government tells you that, okay, ambiguity tolerance changes how people emotionally respond to uncertainty, not whether they recognize bad institutions. In fact, I'd ought to argue that people who can tolerate ambiguity are often better at engaging with broken systems because of the fact that they don't get overwhelmed by things like uncertainty. They can still continue organizing, advocating, and pushing for reform instead of freezing or disengaging. What is the extension coming from opposition side of the house? It's just that how on our side of the house, ambiguity tolerance is the better way to get innovation and progress and the better way to have reform at the end of the day. Because I think we agree with government when they say that the youth have to be the ones to create the future rather than like they have to be the ones who create the future. The problem is on their side of the house they are still traditionalists, which means that they still want to follow the existing systems that are happening currently in status quo, which have already proven time and time again it's not inherently the best thing to do. I think that on our side of the house I think that on government's world, they assume that the stability comes from preserving what already exists. Therefore, when they say that, oh, you probably want to do this, you probably want to rally and things like that. But I think on our side of the house, progress happens because people are able to challenge what already
POI.
currently exists. This means that every innovation already begins with ambiguity, which means before something becomes successful on either side of the house, by the way, people must believe in the possibilities that are not yet proven. Like, for example, when Heaven beautifully explains things like new technologies, things like new
POI.
businesses, things like new social movements, don't badger me. This means that the mechanism is just that on government, they have low ambiguity tolerance. So, for example, they have an unknown idea, they already put it upon the burden of the youth that they have to have a fear of failure. Therefore, they have a better preference for existing solutions. Therefore, they have less experimentation, they have lower innovation, and people ought not to try anymore. This is true because if you look at Lenny's election season, for example, about
POI.
how people's mindset were just that I'm not gonna vote for Lenny anymore because she's going to lose anyway. Therefore, this kind of short-termist mindset and this kind of negative mindset is not something that we probably want between the people in the first place. But sure, POI.
Government has successfully proven that ambiguity is everywhere. Congratulations, we all know water is wet. But the emotion is about the prevalence of ambiguity tolerance. Where's the mechanism that says if we teach millions of young people to tolerate unclear situations, those situations somehow become less harmful?
That is the inherent proof that you are not listening to my speech. Secondly, you ought to not have high ambiguity tolerance, which is what opposition is fighting for, by the way. This is when you have an unknown idea, which means that they will probably have more curiosity about these certain things instead of having fear, which means that you have more of a willingness to test these possibilities in the first place. Therefore, these people are, one, able to learn from failure, but secondly, they're able to create better solutions. The important part is, even if there is failure on our side of the house on the workspace, at least then the failure becomes information. That's where ought to put the comparative, because government says that okay, we're going to protect young people from bad outcomes by doing this and doing that. But the problem is that protecting people from every failure prevents them from developing the ability to be able to create better outcomes. So therefore, in a short-termist mindset, you really cannot solve all the future problems if young people are only trained to preserve past solutions on government side of the house. This includes things like the macro scale, for example, because of the fact that innovation already affects things like economic development. They already affect things like social improvement. Therefore, this is the mechanism in which you probably should weigh judge, because of the fact that it's the most proximate within the young people in the first place. If you really want to have reform, you probably have to be able to also tell people that they can still be able to organize these things despite of the fact that they do have uncertainty in the very first place. And note, this is not only just about the individual youth that government keeps wanting to talk about. This is inherently true because of the fact that entire societies also depend on these young people creating new solutions. Therefore, on the comparative is simple. On government, you're going to protect the existing stability. On our side of the house, you're able to create future possibilities. But sure, let's give government the best case. Suppose that their word actually succeeds and that these people are able to become, I don't know, careful and disciplined. I think in the short term, sure, they're going to make fewer mistakes because they only act when these situations are relatively certain. We can concede this, sure. But on our side of the house, the problem is that government success only exists in environments where there is enough certainty to be able to happen in the first place. On our side of the house, you're able to tackle both. Therefore, even if you have solutions, for example, you can still be uncertain. I think on our side of the house, you're just able, where is it that you're able to best mitigate the harms, and best where you're able to organize yourself and able to actually create innovation for the future generations and for the youth. For all these reasons, up.
Thank you for that speech. Let's have Govwe appear here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, let me soften on. Give me 15 seconds. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this debate is messy because young people already live in a world full of ambiguity. We deal with misinformation, changing norms, unclear institutions, and more information that we can realistically process, right? But the problem here is that the motion isn't about whether ambiguity exists. Rather, we see that it's about what happens when tolerance for it becomes prevalent among the youth, when it becomes the part of how an entire generation learns to understand itself and the world around it. But before anything else, let me clarify our walkthrough. We aren't asking people to demand an immediate answer to everything coming from PM. We want them to remain willing to question and make judgments when answers ought to be reached. There is a difference between giving yourself time to figure out something out and learning that staying uncertain in itself isn't the safest response. But a few call outs then. First, opposition wants us to focus on the fact that tolerance isn't the same as celebration. But once this attitude becomes prevalent, it still shapes what young people learn to accept. The problem is that the more comfortable we become with ambiguity, the less pressure there is to actually resolve it. This is why prevalence matters, panel. If one young person is comfortable with uncertainty, nothing necessarily changes. But when that becomes the dominant attitude across a generation, this is the nose of the debate that prevalence, right? It affects the standards young people develop for themselves, for each other, and for the institutions around them. Secondly,
POI.
opposition tells us that young people shouldn't rush to answers. Fine, but our model never demanded immediate certainty. We want young people to have the confidence to eventually interrogate what they see, and make judgments, right? But then, wait, okay, POI.
If young people are thought to only act once they have certainty, aren't they more likely to accept existing systems because those systems already appear established and proven?
this is where you misconstruct our case, because we never say that this is because uncertainty in our side creates discomfort, making young people question the very systems you want to call out, right? But then third, they tell us that the world is unpredictable and technology is developing incredibly quickly. But that's exactly why we ought to be careful about making ambiguity tolerance the dominant norm. The faster the world changes, the more young people need the instinct to ask why, test what they're told, and search for better answers, right? But then opposition says ambiguity deserves an drives innovation, but they conflate exploring possibilities with actually pursuing one, right? Ambiguity tolerance may encourage exploration if you want to bite into the case, but innovation still requires choosing an idea, committing to it and testing it. But when ambiguity becomes the prevailing mindset, commitment becomes easier to postpone. You can always keep exploring instead of deciding what it's actually worth pursuing. But then fifth, we already talked about incentive. You're going to change what they optimize for. Instead of optimizing for arriving at the best judgment, people increasingly optimize for remaining open to every possibility on opposition side. But then on the issue of identity, this is where I think government wins the most important clash. Young people are still figuring out what they believe, what they value, and what kind of society they want to live in. This is a consensus from both sides of the house, right? But identity isn't something you receive fully formed. You build it by questioning the world around you and making sense of it, right? But when ambiguity tolerance becomes prevalent, it changes the environment in which that identity is formed. Take a youth, for example, who sees corruption in their community but never gets a clear explanation for it. Under our world, that discomfort pushes them to ask who's responsible and why did this even happen in the first place. When a culture of ambiguity tolerance becomes dominant, the risk is that the we don't really know becomes an acceptable place to stop. And this is where Isabu's contribution becomes important, because older generation may already have become accustomed to systems that benefited them, including corruption that has been normalized over multiple generations. The young are the young. This is precisely why the young are the demographic most capable of breaking that cycle, precisely because they are still forming their beliefs or and are less tied to the systems they are inherited. But if ambiguity tolerance becomes the defining attitude for that generation, we lose the potential. The harm is not just that the young people tolerate one unclear situation, right? The harm is that an entire generation grows up learning that uncertainty is something to accomplish rather than something they can accommodate, rather than something they can interrogate. That affects identity, because young people start defining themselves around adaptation without agency. They learn to fit themselves into whatever is already here, instead of asking whether what is already here ought to change. The metric here is whether young people develop the confidence to form and revise their own judgments. Under our side, you get young people to investigate because they don't know. They can get it wrong, they can change their mind, and they can grow. Under a prevalent culture of ambiguity tolerance, the danger is that they learn that if they don't know, then they don't feel the need to. But then second issue, but then how does this identity shape the generation? This is where Leon's material evolves our case, right? If young people grow up with a strong instinct to interrogate uncertainty, that instinct follows them into adulthood. They become voters who ask where public money went, citizens who question unclear policies, and what have you. But if ambiguity tolerance becomes prevalent, the opposite social habit can develop. An institution gives a vague answer, people accept that it's complicated, but nobody even pushes it further, and eventually the absence of an answer becomes normal. This is especially dangerous for corruption, because ambiguity can shift responsibility away from the people who ought to provide clarity and onto the public that has to live with the consequences. So the mechanism is that a prevalent culture of ambiguity tolerance, and I really want to push through the prevalence here, that young is where young people become accustomed to unresolved uncertainty, and this shapes their identity and expectation of what is normal. They become less likely to interrogate institutions, and those institutions then face less pressure to change. That is why this is bigger than individual resilience. But the tipping point here is that what kind of generation are we even creating? Opposition is right that young people need to cope up with an unpredictable world, but government asks a more important question here. What happens when coping with uncertainty becomes so normal that young people stop feeling the need to challenge it? Propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have opposition appear here.
Hi, am I audible and clear?
Yep.
Okay, name's Abby. POIs at the 5 minute mark. Pronoun she, her. Yeah, please don't badger. I'll take one for the clarity and the engagement of this debate. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think it's important to realize that uncertainty never breeds comfort. Uncertainty, by nature, is uncomfortable. That's why we have to learn how to sit and understand it. It's a very prerequisite that you have to understand, especially when government tries to push for institutional change, how people actually act better. But we tell you in this debate, but you only get those benefits only when you understand why it's important to tolerate this ambiguity in the first place. Number one, then, on rebuttals. They say that it changes how you form because when you have uncertainty, you delay how they have in decision making, you delay how they commit to things, and you don't actually have them make solid decisions. But I think at the very end of the day, what's important to understand here is that you only get or proper or actually correct decisions when people have a clear mind and understand how to act in between pressure. In terms of pressure, because it's important to understand in a changing and evolving society, people will always need answers. People will always look for clarity. So the important question is to how do you actually have clear how do you actually come up with a good solution or have proper answers even amidst uncertainty that you face and this uncertainty keeps on shifting, right? I think then, secondly, on the answers about how reforms actually are better in their side of the house because people are much more likely to call these institutions out because they're just not like sitting complacently about how people answer these things ambiguously. I think that's also untrue because I think it's important to understand that reforms are harder to push and are harder to succeed when groups cannot act under pressure. It's important when you understand that reform have form core groups. That's why people don't rely on just one person to actually enact change. They're a whole community, they're a whole union, and you have to understand that in order to push for change, people have to have a clear mindset. They have to act under pressure. They have to act under the ambiguity of these peoples and these institutions in order to call out proper changes. Number one, let's go on then to identifying the clashes and weighing why, despite the worst case that UP has, we still win on this debate. Number one, on the clashes on where the youth are better off at. What they tell us in government is that, oh, there is a need for solution in the world because we need to demand change and accountability from these institutions because when you have ambiguity tolerance, you kind of blur the idea of this tolerance and resilience and that not everything is productive or that the youth are more vulnerable to the ambiguity. I think Heaven already reframes this debate by saying that the youth wants to build capacity to function even in ambiguity without certain clarity. This is an important characterization in this debate because you have to understand that,
Joy,
oh, yes,
can you name me a reform that succeeded because people tolerated uncertainty rather than because they eventually became convinced enough to commit to a solution?
I think you're not understanding or making out check your notes. It's clear that in order to have proper change, you still need uncertainty. But when you always act on uncertainty and you don't have a clear plan in mind, that's when reforms fail. I think if that this ambiguity tolerance doesn't mean that you have to be blinded by everything that's happening in society. I think people are rational. They know what's right or wrong. Therefore, the question is, how do they act under this uncertainty? How do they act under this pressure? How do they act when institutions don't have clear answer? That's when they actually formulate their solution on their own. You have to understand that in order to actually grow, people have to have a proper time frame of how they do these things. I.e., for example, what would happen in government is that you need answers immediately. You have to have accountability. But what would happen in opposition that even if Star Duterte doesn't give us enough answer about her transparency, we still subscribe how to have like direct changes within it by thinking properly ahead on the long term is because you as we already pushed you, you already think of the short terms, but how do you think on the long term? Probably what would happen is the youth would scrutinize more about who to vote so that they don't have to encounter these same problems in the very first place. They'll have to think about who to enact, who these people in holding these powers in the institutions are actually gonna go to because they don't want to keep encountering this same thing over and over again, right? I think it's very clear then that the second clash in this debate is how does this ambiguity tolerance actually affect institutions. They tell us that on the second clashes, they tell that you need stronger conviction in order to call out these institutions because you delay formation. You remove the urgency for the youth to actually enact change because you normalize this ambiguity. But Aki already tells you that it's clear that you only have this decision making when you have ambiguity tolerance because you actually create people who have better mindsets or how to actually enact proper changes because they're not always rushing to create solutions even when it's substandard. You have to understand that in order to push for reform, and Aki already explains this beautifully, in order to have proper reforms, you have to have certainty regardless of how uncertain institutions are acting. This means that even when things aren't actually going your way, you can actually adjust your plans in order to survive because you have to understand that people have this mindset because they want to survive regardless of how society is actually acting. You have to also understand that people who are struggling can't really think about what will happen in the short term. They want to think about how they're actually going to survive in the long term, how they're going to feed their families through the day. That's why having this ambiguity tolerance is important for them because when you just keep on scrutinizing, when you just keep on overthinking what will happen, you don't actually enact change. What they want is concrete and solid action that's actually much more plausible and proximate towards them. And you can only get this when you have this tolerance towards uncertainty, towards what is uncomfortable. And this is exactly the prerequisite you can the prerequisite to all the benefits on your side of the house when you want to tell us that, oh, you have one less person to create change. But we tell you that when you have this ambiguity tolerance, people will keep evolving, people will keep having developments, people will keep innovating so that this problem doesn't continue to exist and doesn't amplify in the future because this is exactly what they want to avoid. They want to avoid this. What's clear here is that the best case of government is that even in the short term they make less mistake but they don't look at the long term on how to actually achieve this, as opposed to the worst case of opposition where sure probably you don't have people immediately calling institutions out, you don't have people actually holding them accountable, but in the long term there's much more clearer and plausible actions how to actually create reforms, how to call out better institutions because there's more time frame for people to actually think about what's better, think of rational decisions without actually just facing the battle. It's like how the idea of ceteris paribus in economy doesn't apply to the real world because everything keeps on shifting. That's why certainty is not something that you have to hold on to. You don't need to have a plan for everything. What you need is adaptability in the world that keeps on changing. What you need is adaptability, especially when the leaders itself are actually the ones feeding you. When these leaders aren't capable, when these leaders are sufficient, how do you then survive by yourself to in order to thrive in a world that keeps on changing, as well as how do you call these people out even when you're under pressure? I think the prerequisite to that is all answered by opposition friends when you have this ambiguity tolerance. With all of that said, protopose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's have opposition reply here.
I have an up reply. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. Are we better off with young people who can function and adapt despite uncertainty, or young people who are pressured to pretend that they already have the answers? Ambiguity tolerance, as defined by the info slide, is literally the capacity to navigate unclear situations without unnecessary stress or anxiety while maintaining an open-minded approach. So obviously, this is not about us being apathetic and not making decisions anymore. This is not about us accepting institutional failure as is. This is not about us staying confused forever. Government had to prove why the prevalence of the mindset causes more harm than good, and they failed because they continuously attacked a completely different idea. Gov's lack of concessions is the reason why this debate is very, very messy. At least on side opposition, you have a clear idea of what the prevalence does and why it does more good than harm. The biggest issue with government is that they create a false dichotomy between certainty and progress. Their entire world assumes that when people become certain, they automatically become more willing to do things like demand reform or challenge institutions. This is logically not true. They don't mechanize this. Being certain does not automatically mean being correct. And this is the biggest hole in their case. Because if institutions themselves can provide wrong information as Gov admitted, then certainty can actually be the very thing that prevents reform. Institutions will become stagnant when they believe that they already have the correct answer. People stop questioning because they believe that there is nothing left to question. Our side never said that uncertainty is the final destination. We said that uncertainty is the starting point of reflection, primarily because humans always want meaning. When you're uncertain, you ask questions like, is this working? Is this correct? Is there a better alternative? This This kind of skepticism is precisely what creates progress. Government's only substantive contribution is that tolerance prevents commitment, but their entire argument ignores the quality of commitment that you get, because the commitment on side government is very, very bad. Because the question in this debate is not whether people eventually commit, because obviously they will commit, but the question is, do people commit after enough reflection, or do they commit because they were pressured to have certainty? I want to point out that a person can be committed to a harmful belief, they can be committed to a solution that does not work. Government never proved why having an answer faster creates a better answer. In fact, every innovation and every reform and every breakthrough literally started from a place where people were uncertain. Before women gained rights, before societies challenged structures, before new technologies existed, someone had to believe that something different was possible despite not having the complete answer yet. You don't rush things because good things takes time. When you self-introspect, when you philosophize about the world, when you become a skeptic, progress happens. Progress happens because people are uncertain enough to imagine that it can be better. Progress does not happen because people are certain that the current world is correct. Gov tells you that institutions often fail young people and that people need to demand change. This strengthens our case, right? Because if institutions can fail, then young people need the ability to critically engage with uncertainty. They need to ask questions like, who benefits from this structure? Is this even correct? Their alternative is dangerous because certainty can make people accept existing structures simply because they appear established or simply because they were the norm. The reason people challenge systems is because they recognize that the current answer may not be enough. Their world rewards people for finding certainty. On our side of the house, we self-introspect, then we can find the truth. First clash then, which is the most important clash, government tells you that uncertainty makes people stop acting. Again, this is a slippery slope. Naturally, people want answers, and ambiguity tolerance does not remove that desire. The difference is that instead of immediately attaching themselves to the first available answer, they take time to question and improve things, especially for young people who are still forming their identities when they are literally surrounded by things like changing careers or changing expectations and changing technology or whatnot. They cannot rely on the same certainty the previous generations had. Teaching them to function despite uncertainty does not make them weaker. It makes them prepared, right? You make people realize that being uncertain is natural because this is part of the world that you live in. This is this house of most motion. This is not a policy motion. You cannot challenge the institutions that we have. The least we can do is be natural, and when we face this kind of capitalistic structures that exist, the least we can do is become uncertain and become skeptic. Again, this is this house of most motion. The prevalence will still exist on both sides of the house. This debate is just about the extent. What does for harm than good? On side opposition, we were able to clearly defend what are the net benefits of this.
Thank you for that speech. To end the debate, let's have government reply. Here.
Here, wait. uh, Hi, I'm LO. I'll be doing a live speech. I'll start my speech in three, two, one. Ignorance is bliss, but ambiguity is only comforting when you're not the person suffering from the consequences of not knowing. They tell you that people can work well under pressure because they are not afraid of uncertainty. But notice the logical jump. The ability to function under pressure is not the same thing as tolerating ambiguity. I can perform well during an exam without believing that unclear instructions are good because resilience is the ability to respond to uncertainty. Ambiguity tolerance is the willingness to accept uncertainty. Those are like fundamentally different things. And this distinction actually matters because opposition confuses the symptom with a solution. The reason people become successful under pressure is not because they enjoy not knowing what is happening. It's because they have skills, they have resources, and the motivation to allow them to navigate different circumstances. They succeed because they are trying to resolve that uncertainty. But notice how we never even said that you should be certain. It's the process you take to be certain that's important. If you tolerate uncertainty, why would you even ask questions to institutions that you're literally okay now with not knowing? Suppose I want to take IT, but AI is rapidly changing the industry. I don't become secure simply because I'm more tolerant of ambiguity. To actually become confident in my decision, I have to reduce the ambiguity. One, probably advocate for guardrails on AI, but two, continuously upskill by learning AI tools and etc. Notice that every one of these actors has the same objective: to reduce uncertainty, not to simply tolerate tolerate it. Why is opposition case harmful? Not because people stop doing all of these things. The harm is that they become less motivated to do them. If uncertainty no longer feels psychologically costly, there is less urgency to investigate, to advocate, or adapt and prepare. For example, why do you have to post? It's not that nobody upskills, it's that fewer people feel compelled to fundamentally change the conditions creating that uncertainty. Literally, why protest against exploitative AI if you've literally learn to psychologically adapt to it. I'll discuss three issues in the debate. One, on what young people actually need, adaptability or accountability. This is the most important issue because this emotion not the youth. A, who is closest to understanding the actor? I think opposition fundamentally misunderstands young people. They assume young people's biggest problem is that they cannot handle uncertainty. But that is not true. Young people already live in uncertainty and status quo. They already deal with changing job markets and academic pressure. The problem is not that young people are too fragile. The problem is that young people are often placed in systems where they are forced to adapt to problems they did not create. And government's opposition solution is that you should make them better at adopting. But government asked, why are we making individuals better at surviving bad systems instead of making systems better for these individuals? Because notice how even in their best case, that young people become resilient and flexible, that already happens on our side. A young person can still explore different careers, for example. The only thing we reject is the idea that confusion itself should become something admirable. But B, what does the actor really want in the debate? And what's the actor really need? One, I think government assumes that young people want infinite possibilities. They assume the best life is one where you are constantly comfortable with not knowing. But we think that fundamentally misunderstands human beings because people do not only want flexibility, they want direction. It's only under government where young people can tolerate uncertainty when necessary, but still demand enough clarity to make meaningful decisions. But see, even if we grant their strongest possible assumption, why do we still win? Even if I give opposition their best case, that ambiguity tolerance creates more creative young people, we still win because creativity requires uncertainty, but it does not require accepting uncertainty forever. The best innovators are not people who simply tolerate unclear problems. Opposition confuses patience with progress. Literally, civil rights movements did not happen because people became comfortable with unclear equality. But secondly, on accountability, who benefits from ambiguity tolerance? Opposition tells you that ambiguity tolerance empowers young people, but ask yourself then, who benefits the most when young people become comfortable with unclear situations? It is not the young people, it is often the people creating those situations in the first place. This is the biggest comparative in the debate. Under opposition, when institutions fail, the burden shifts downward. The worker has to become more adaptable. The student has to become more flexible. But why is the individual responsible for adjusting to a system that refuses to provide that clarity? Their world creates people who are extremely good at surviving uncertainty, but less willing to ask why that uncertainty exists. And this matters because accountability requires clear expectations. But thirdly, they tell you that because uncertainty is not stigmatized, young people no longer feel pressured to have everything figured out immediately. But notice the assumption hidden underneath. They assume that biggest problems young people face are is that they are too afraid to explore. We disagree. The biggest problem is not that young people are incapable of exploring possibilities. The biggest problem is that young people are increasingly forced to navigate systems where answers are unclear and where the consequences of uncertainty are very real. Because there's a very big difference between you not rushing into decisions because you're exploring your options and you being comfortable with not having answers because society no longer expects clarity. Opposition blurs these two things, which is why government takes the win. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that speech. That ends the debate. Debaters, you may now cross the house. Please give me at most 10 minutes to deliberate by myself. Yeah, congrats. Hello everyone, I'm Gasa. I was the chair for the round. That being said, my OA will go as follows. Two things, of course. Firstly, the decision, and secondly, the justifications. If I have time, I'm going to give general observations and comments right after. On to the decision then, what I think was a great round. The winner is side opposition. Again, the winner is side opposition. I want to premise that I could not tackle all of the things said in the debate due to limited time, but I will be highlighting the key issues that serve as the tipping point for my decision. Thus, I found one main issue and one sub-issue. I'll be focusing on the main issue. If I have time, I'm going to also talk about the sub-issue that I found. Onto the main issue on the round then. It's on whether ambiguity tolerance leads to better or worse systemic outcomes. So it's on rather we challenge it directly coming from government versus challenging systems with probably a more introspective way coming from side opposition. I'll have to explain why this issue is important. I think that the debate is fundamentally about whether we want a generation that is more likely to challenge the broken systems coming from government or one that is more capable of navigating and operating within real world uncertainty coming from opposition. I think that the whole clash of the round basically determines whether the ambiguity tolerance ultimately improves or worsens environmental and societal outcomes. That being said, what does government give in the round then? I think that government gives a very compelling structural analysis that when ambiguity tolerance becomes prevalent, it normalizes dysfunction. I think that the strongest contribution is the idea of manufactured ambiguity, that much of the uncertainty youth face is not natural, but it is the result of poor governance or exploitative systems. They argue that if young people are taught to tolerate ambiguity, they are less likely to identify these conditions as failures and therefore less likely to challenge them, which creates weaker pressure on governments and corporations to reform, which allows harmful systems to persist. How does opposition respond to this? Opposition reframes the debate by number one, clarifying that ambiguity tolerance is adapting to change and maintaining open-minded approach to ambiguous circumstances. So it's not that we tolerate uncertainty in and of itself, but it gives solutions to the youth to navigate systems when there is uncertainty. Secondly, their mechanism is that people who are less overwhelmed by ambiguity are more likely to participate and sustain involvement in solving problems. I think importantly, OP does not deny that systems are flawed. They instead argue that without the ability to tolerate ambiguity, individuals are more likely to disengage or probably avoid complex issues altogether. Thus, ambiguity tolerance becomes a precondition for any meaningful action, including systemic change. How did I weigh this? This comes in three metrics. Number one, unlikelihood analysis. I think that this metric is the most decisive, mainly because both sides made predictive claims about human behavior under uncertainty, and I think that the debate ultimately hinged on what young people are more likely to do in the real world. Coming from government, their analysis here is genuinely compelling, and I think it deserves to be not proven, but it deserves to be credited, not probably in the fullest extent. I think that they argue that when ambiguity becomes normalized, individuals psychologically adjust their expectation downwards, which means to say that over time, what once could have been seen as unacceptable, like for example, unclear institutional rules or inconsistent enforcement, becomes something people simply learn to navigate rather than resist, which then creates a shift, which means that if dissatisfaction no longer translates into action because individuals reinterpret instability as inevitable, I think importantly, they're able to explain that it's not just about apathy, but it's also about adaptation, where people will still function, but they redirect their energy towards coping strategies rather than systemic challenge. In that sense, government provides a very plausible behavioral pathway explaining how tolerance could dampen resistance at scale. I think furthermore, government's model aligns with probably real world observations of institutional persistence, where many systems do not collapse under criticism precisely because individuals learn to operate within them despite the flaws. So, if ambiguity tolerance reinforces that adaptability, government is right to worry that it removes a key trigger for reform. It's probably the refusal to accept unclear or unjust conditions. I think that their argument is especially strong in contexts where reform depends on collective dissatisfaction reaching a tipping point. So, which means to say that if tolerance diffuses that dissatisfaction, systemic change becomes less likely. I think that this is a high probability mechanism in environments where individuals have limited power individually but rely on collective pressure. However, even granting all of this, opposition introduces a prior question that ultimately becomes more determinative in the round. So, what happens if individuals cannot tolerate ambiguity in the first place? Their argument is that without this tolerance, uncertainty does not produce resistance, but it produces probably paralysis and probably withdrawal. So, when faced with complex, unclear systems, many young people may simply disengage rather than challenge them. I think that this is particularly persuasive because it reflects psychological responses to the youth to uncertainty. It's probably anxiety, it's probably indecision and cognitive overload. I think in this world, the absence of ambiguity tolerance does not increase activism, but it decreases participation altogether. I think what makes opposition's contribution more likely unbalanced is that it operates at a more fundamental level of human behavior. Governance mechanism requires individuals to first remain engaged enough to adapt, whereas opposition shows that without tolerance, many individuals may never reach that stage. In other words, government describes how behavior changes after engagement is secured, while opposition explains whether engagement happens at all, because coming from opposition, they're able to explain that action is a prerequisite for both compliance and resistance. Thus, opposition's world, where individuals at least remain engaged, becomes more probable as a baseline condition. Thus, even while being highly charitable to government's concern about normalization, the comparative likelihood still favors opposition, where it is more realistic that ambiguity tolerance produces some level of engagement, even if it's imperfect, than that intolerance produces widespread sustained resistance. I think that the risk of total disengagement is simply more behaviorally immediate and therefore more likely. Second metric then, on the incentives of actors. Government persuasively argues that systems respond to pressure and that pressure is generated when individuals refuse to accept ambiguity or dysfunction. So if people become more tolerant of unclear or inconsistent conditions, institutions face weaker incentives to clarify rules or to probably improve transparency. I think that this creates a feedback loop where tolerance reduces pressure, then reduced pressure slows reform, then slow reform further entrenches ambiguity. I think importantly, government does not claim that individuals become complacent in a moral sense, but rather that the threshold for dissatisfaction shifts upward, which makes collective mobilization less likely. I think that this is a very strong structural argument about how macro level change occurs, and I'm able to credit this coming from government. However, opposition expands the analysis by introducing a missing variable in government's model. It's the human capacity to respond to incentives. They argue that incentives only function if individuals are psychologically and cognitively able to act on them. So if ambiguity intolerance leads to stress or to burnout or to avoidance, then even strong incentives to challenge systems may not translate into actual behavior. I think in this sense, government's model assumes a level of consistent engagement that may not exist without ambiguity tolerance. I think opposition's contribution is particularly important because it shifts the discussion from whether incentives exist to whether or not they are actionable. So in a world of high ambiguity tolerance, which is conceded by both teams, individuals may recognize problems but feel overwhelmed by their complexity or uncertainty coming from side gov, which leads to disengagement rather than action. I think by contrast, ambiguity tolerant individuals are more likely to remain involved over time, even when outcomes are unclear or progress is slow. This sustained engagement is what allows incentives, whether to comply or to challenge, to actually operate. But being very charitable to government, their concern about reduced pressure is real and very significant. However, opposition ultimately provides a more complete model by accounting for both structural incentives and individual responsiveness, because they're able to explain that without engagement, incentives are inert. Therefore, even if ambiguity tolerance slightly weakens the intensity of pressure on systems, it ensures that there is at least a consistent base of individuals that are capable of generating that pressure over time, or that are able to generate or navigate these kinds of problems even with uncertainty. I think on balance, opposition edges this metric not because government's analysis is weak, it is actually quite strong, but I think that because opposition integrates it into a broader and more behaviorally grounded framework, they show that the existence of incentives is insufficient without the capacity to act on them, and ambiguity tolerance is what sustains that capacity. Very quickly then, on just the conclusion of like all the issue, I think that this was a very close round, or I think, yeah, this was a very close round where government provided strong structural analysis about systems and incentives. However, opposition ultimately wins because they better prove that ambiguity tolerance is a necessary precondition for action and psychological functioning. So, even if it carries risks, it ensures that individuals remain engaged and capable of navigating uncertainty, which is more likely to produce meaningful outcomes overall. I think the clarification coming from opposition is to say that we do not tolerate uncertainty, but tolerance of uncertainty, whatever, means that we're able to navigate problems with the experience of uncertainty and what have you, which is probably the why opposition has to win it over government. Thus, with that being said, the decision is final. Yeah, congrats on round two.